The sun was setting outside the large glass windows of Dallas International Airport, casting long shadows across the crowded terminal. It was one of those hectic Friday evenings when everyone seemed to be rushing somewhere important. Flight delays had turned the usually spacious Terminal C into a sea of frustrated travelers, all hoping to reach their destinations before the weekend slipped away. Among the crowds, a businesswoman in her mid-30s stood out in her crisp navy suit and clicking heels. Her perfectly styled hair and designer luggage screamed corporate success, but the constant checking of her expensive watch betrayed her growing irritation. The Chicago flight had already been delayed twice, and her patience was wearing thinner by the minute. She had managed to snag one of the few available seats near the gate, spreading her belongings across an extra chair to discourage anyone from sitting too close. Her fingers danced across her phone screen as she fired off emails, barely looking up at the waves of people passing by. The overhead speakers crackled with another delay announcement, causing collective groans throughout the terminal. Just then, a young soldier caught everyone's attention as he made his way through the crowd. His uniform was neat but showed signs of long travel, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't rested in quite some time. He carried a heavy military duffel bag that looked like it had seen its fair share of dust and sand. Many passengers noticed how he slightly favored his right leg as he walked, though he was clearly trying not to show it. The soldier had been standing for what seemed like hours, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His connecting flights from overseas had been a marathon of delays and rushed terminals, and exhaustion was written all over his face. A kind elderly couple had offered him some water earlier, which he had accepted with genuine gratitude. The terminal continued to fill as more delayed flights merged their waiting passengers into the already crowded space. Some people sat on their suitcases, while others leaned against walls or pillars. Children were getting cranky, and parents were running out of distractions to keep them occupied. The air was thick with that unique mix of anxiety and frustration that only airports can create. The businesswoman remained absorbed in her digital world, oblivious to the growing discomfort around her. Her carry-on bag still occupied the empty seat beside her, while her designer tote took up another. She occasionally glanced at the gate counter, where airline staff were dealing with a line of increasingly impatient passengers asking about their delayed flights. As the evening wore on, the soldier's fatigue became more apparent. He had been standing near a support pillar, occasionally shifting his duffel bag from one shoulder to the other. His eyes scanned the seating area, looking for any available spot to rest. The long flights and endless waiting had taken their toll, and even his military training couldn't hide the wariness in his stance. The scene was set for what would become a memorable evening at Gate C-23. The mix of delayed flights, tired travelers, and fraying nerves had created the perfect storm. Nobody in that terminal could have guessed how the next few minutes would unfold, or how a simple interaction would lead to consequences that would change several lives forever. The air conditioning hummed steadily overhead, mixing with the musical chimes of arrival announcements and the constant murmur of hundreds of conversations. Outside, the Dallas skyline had begun to twinkle in the growing darkness, while inside, the fluorescent lights cast their harsh glow over the unfolding scene. What happened next would become a story that would be shared countless times, a reminder that our choices in moments of discomfort often reveal the true nature of our character. The young soldier took a deep breath, gathering his courage as he approached the businesswoman's seat. His boots, though polished, showed the wear of long months of service, and his movement was careful, deliberate. The crowded terminal had grown even more packed in the last half hour, with virtually no empty seats in sight except for the two being used for the businesswoman's bags. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying the politeness that came from years of military discipline. "I hate to bother you, but I've been standing for nearly 20 hours straight through different connections. Would it be possible to use one of these seats? I'd really appreciate it." The businesswoman barely glanced up from her phone, her fingers continuing to type as if the interruption was nothing more than a minor annoyance. The screen's blue light reflected off her expensive jewelry, creating tiny dancing spots on the ceiling above. Her response came with a dismissive wave of her hand, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested she was used to getting her way. "These seats are taken," she said curtly, despite the obvious fact that they only held her designer bags. "I'm a first-class passenger and I need my space to work. Try the next terminal. She shifted slightly, turning her body away from the soldier as if to end the conversation before it could really begin. Several nearby passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. A mother holding a sleeping toddler shook her head quietly, while an elderly man in a business suit frowned deeply at the scene unfolding before him. The air in the terminal seemed to grow thicker with tension as people watched the interaction. The soldier stood there for a moment, his face showing no anger or frustration, just a tired acceptance that spoke volumes about his character. His duffel bag weighed heavily on his shoulder, and the slight sway in his stance revealed just how exhausted he truly was. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows under his eyes, emphasizing the fatigue etched across his young face. "I understand, ma'am," he replied quietly, adjusting his bag. "Thank you for your time." The dignity in his response made the businesswoman's behavior seem even more callous. He began to turn away, his movements slightly stiff from the long hours of travel and standing. A teenager sitting nearby quickly offered his seat, but the soldier gave him a kind smile and shook his head. "Keep your seat, buddy," he said warmly. "You were here first." This simple act of consideration, even in his own moment of need, didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. The businesswoman continued typing on her phone, seemingly oblivious to the ripple of disapproval spreading through the terminal. Her designer heels tapped impatiently against the floor as she checked her watch again, her only concern apparently being the flight delay rather than the impact of her actions. The scene might have ended there, just another moment of thoughtlessness in a busy airport, but fate had other plans. Unknown to the businesswoman, someone very important had witnessed every second of the interaction, someone whose presence would soon turn this small act of unkindness into a life-changing moment. As the soldier made his way to a far wall, choosing to sit on his duffel bag rather than accept seats offered by other passengers, the evening began to take an unexpected turn. The air conditioning continued its steady hum, mixing with the ambient noise of the terminal, but there was a new undercurrent of tension in the atmosphere. Sometimes the smallest choices we make can have the biggest consequences, and this seemingly minor interaction was about to prove exactly that. The next few minutes would demonstrate how quickly life can change when we least expect it, and how our treatment of others can come back to affect us in ways we never imagined. The businesswoman continued her work, unaware that her world was about to shift dramatically, all because of a simple choice made in a crowded airport terminal. Just 3 seats behind the businesswoman sat a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s. His simple yet expertly tailored charcoal suit spoke of real success, the kind that doesn't need to show off. He had been quietly observing the entire scene while pretending to read the newspaper in his hands, though his attention hadn't been on the headlines for quite some time. As the CEO of a major company, he had learned long ago that watching people when they didn't know they were being watched revealed their true character. His silver hair and kind eyes might have made him look like just another business traveler, but there was an air of quiet authority about him that people naturally respected. He noticed every detail of the interaction, the soldier's polite request, the tired lines around the young man's eyes, and the businesswoman's dismissive wave that seemed to brush away basic human kindness as if it were an inconvenience. Each moment registered clearly as he watched over the edge of his newspaper, his expression remaining neutral even as his disappointment grew. The whole scene struck particularly close to home for him. 25 years earlier, he had been that same tired soldier, standing in a different airport, hoping for a small kindness. He remembered the weight of the duffel bag, the ache in his feet, and the bone-deep exhaustion that came from serving overseas. But he also remembered the people who had shown him kindness back then, strangers who had offered their seats, shared their snacks, or simply given him a warm smile. Now, as he watched the businesswoman continue to tap away at her phone, his mind was already working through tomorrow's necessary actions. He recognized her, of course. She was one of his company's rising executives, someone who had impressed everyone with her business acumen and sharp decision-making skills. But this moment was showing him a side of her character that no amount of perfectly presented quarterly reports could reveal. The irony wasn't lost on him. She was actually working on a presentation about company values and community outreach, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she fine-tuned the words that now seemed so hollow in light of her actions. The leather portfolio beside her contained the company logo, the same logo that was subtly embroidered on his own briefcase. He watched as other passengers offered their seats to the soldier and how the young man politely declined each offer, choosing instead to make himself as inconspicuous as possible near a far wall. The CEO's own military training recognized the bearing of a soldier who was used to putting others before himself, even when exhausted. The terminal's announcements continued to echo overhead, mixing with the general buzz of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter or crying children. Outside, the night had fully settled in, and the terminal's lights reflected against the dark windows, creating a fishbowl effect that seemed to intensify the drama of the unfolding scene. The CEO took out his phone, quietly typing a few brief messages. One went to his executive assistant, another to the head of human resources. Neither message was long, but both would set things in motion for the coming week. In his experience, character wasn't built in moments of convenience and comfort, it was revealed in moments of choice when no one seemed to be watching. As the evening wore on, he noticed how the businesswoman remained oblivious to the impact of her actions. She hadn't even noticed him sitting there, despite having given a presentation to him just last week. Her world was still spinning exactly as she thought it should, but that world was about to shift dramatically. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come when we least expect them, wrapped in moments that seem insignificant at the time. As the CEO folded his newspaper and checked his own flight details, he knew that this evening would become one of those teaching moments, not just for the businesswoman, but for everyone who would eventually hear this story. The young soldier made his way to a quiet corner of the terminal, his boots making soft sounds against the polished floor. He found a spot near a large pillar, away from the main crowd, and carefully lowered his duffel bag to the ground. With practiced efficiency, he arranged the bag to serve as a makeshift seat, something he'd clearly done many times before during his service. The terminal had grown quieter now, but the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken reactions to what everyone had just witnessed. An elderly couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disapproval. A businessman in a wrinkled suit stood up, walked over to the airport coffee shop, and returned a few minutes later with 2 cups. Without saying a word, he offered one to the soldier along with a respectful nod. "Thank you, sir," the soldier said quietly, accepting the coffee with genuine gratitude. The simple gesture seemed to break a dam of sorts, and suddenly others began to show their support in small but meaningful ways. A college student offered her phone charger when she noticed the soldier checking his device. A mother asked if he'd like some of the homemade cookies she'd packed for her journey. The soldier politely declined most offers of seats, but accepted these small kindnesses with a warmth that made each person feel their gesture was truly appreciated. His humble responses and genuine smile stood in stark contrast to the businesswoman's earlier behavior, making her actions seem even more callous in retrospect. Meanwhile, other travelers had begun sharing the story with newcomers entering the terminal. In hushed voices, they explained what had happened, each telling adding to the ripple effect of disapproval. Some people took out their phones, typing away, perhaps sharing the story on social media or messaging friends about what they'd witnessed. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at her father's sleeve and asked in that loud, clear voice that children often use, "Daddy, why didn't that lady want to share her seats? You always tell me sharing is caring." Her father's response was gentle but firm, using the moment as a teaching opportunity about kindness and respect. The businesswoman remained focused on her phone, but subtle signs showed she wasn't as oblivious as she appeared. Her typing had become more aggressive, her posture more rigid. Occasionally, she'd glance around quickly, perhaps finally sensing the atmosphere her actions had created. Her foot tapped faster against the floor, betraying a growing unease. Near the gate counter, 2 flight attendants discussed the situation in low voices, occasionally glancing toward both the soldier and the businesswoman. One made a few notes on her tablet, while the other shook her head softly. Years of experience had taught them how to handle difficult situations with diplomacy, and they were clearly planning something. The soldier had taken out a small notebook and was writing something, possibly a letter home. His calm demeanor and quiet dignity made many passengers reflect on their own behavior and choices. A businessman who had been loudly complaining about the delay earlier now sat quietly, seeming deep in thought as he watched the scene unfold. Outside, planes continued to take off and land, their lights blinking against the dark sky. Inside, the terminal had become a stage where a simple act of unkindness had transformed into a powerful lesson about humanity. The air conditioning hummed steadily, mixing with the soft murmur of conversations and occasional announcements, but there was a new undertone to the atmosphere, one of shared disapproval and quiet solidarity with the soldier. People continued to find subtle ways to show their support. A flight attendant happened to walk by with an extra bottle of water. An elderly veteran, wearing a baseball cap with military insignia, made his way over just to stand near the soldier for a moment, exchanging a knowing look that spoke volumes without a word being said. What no one in the terminal realized yet was that this evening was far from over. The real consequences of the businesswoman's choice were still to come, and the next few minutes would bring a twist that no one, except perhaps the quiet CEO still watching from his seat, could have anticipated. The moment everything changed started with a simple announcement. Attention passengers on Flight 2237 to Chicago, we are now ready to begin our pre-boarding process. We'd like to invite our active military personnel and first-class passengers to board at this time. The businesswoman quickly gathered her belongings, stuffing her phone into her designer purse while simultaneously trying to arrange her papers that had scattered across the seats. In her rush to be first in line, she knocked her leather portfolio to the ground, sending several documents sliding across the floor. As she bent to retrieve them, she finally looked up, really looked up, for the first time in hours. And that's when she saw him. The CEO of her company was standing right there, barely 3 feet away, picking up one of her fallen documents. The same CEO she had given a presentation to last week about corporate responsibility and community values. The color drained from her face so quickly that a nearby passenger asked if she was feeling all right. Her hand froze midway to accepting the paper he was holding out to her. Time seemed to stand still in that moment, the bustling airport fading into background noise as the reality of the situation crashed over her. The CEO's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes held a weight that made the businesswoman's stomach drop. He had seen everything: her dismissal of the soldier, her rudeness, her complete lack of the very values she had so confidently presented to him last week. "I believe this belongs to you," he said quietly, holding out the document. It was, ironically, a page from her presentation about the company's commitment to supporting military veterans. The company logo at the top seemed to mock her as she took the paper with trembling fingers. Around them, other first-class passengers were already lining up, their tickets ready. The soldier had risen from his makeshift seat, gathering his duffel bag with practiced efficiency. He stood at a respectful distance from the first-class line, waiting for his turn to board with the other military personnel. The CEO adjusted his tie slightly, a small gesture that the businesswoman recognized from board meetings. It was something he did when he was about to make an important decision. Her heart began to race as she realized that this wasn't just an embarrassing moment, this could have serious consequences for her career. "Interesting evening," the CEO commented, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested there was much more to be said later. He glanced at his watch, the same model she had once proudly noticed they shared, and then looked toward the soldier. The businesswoman opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to perhaps salvage something from this disaster, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? Every excuse that came to mind sounded hollow even in her own thoughts. Other passengers were watching the interaction with interest, though they couldn't know the full weight of what was happening. The same audience that had witnessed her earlier behavior was now watching this unexpected sequel, and many seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding. The flight attendant at the gate called for first-class boarding again. The businesswoman stood frozen, her boarding pass clutched so tightly in her hand that it was beginning to crumple. The CEO gave her a small nod and stepped away, moving purposefully toward the soldier. The terminal's bright lights suddenly felt too harsh, too exposing. The businesswoman could feel heat rising in her cheeks as she watched her boss approach the young soldier. She had spent years building her career, carefully crafting her professional image, and now, in the space of a few thoughtless minutes, she had revealed a side of herself that could undo everything. As the CEO engaged the soldier in conversation, their words too quiet to hear, the businesswoman finally understood something profound. Our character isn't determined by how we behave in client meetings or board presentations, but by how we treat others when we think no one of consequence is watching. The first-class cabin felt unusually quiet as passengers settled into their seats. The businesswoman sat rigidly in 2A, her usual pre-flight routine forgotten. She hadn't even taken out her laptop, something she did on every flight without fail. Instead, her eyes kept darting to the cabin entrance, watching as other passengers boarded. The CEO had disappeared after his conversation with the soldier, and the uncertainty of what he might do was making her stomach churn. She jumped slightly when her phone buzzed, a work email she'd normally be eager to answer, but now it seemed trivial compared to the weight of her situation. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks. When she reached the businesswoman's seat, her professional smile held a hint of coolness. Word had clearly spread among the crew about what had happened in the terminal. The businesswoman declined the drink, her throat too tight with anxiety to swallow anything. Then she saw them, the CEO and the soldier, walking down the aisle together. Her boss was carrying his own briefcase and had somehow managed to help the soldier with his heavy duffel bag, despite the soldier's polite protests. The CEO guided the young man to a seat in first class, right across from where the businesswoman sat. "Here you are," the CEO said warmly to the soldier. "Please make yourself comfortable. I've arranged for a meal to be served once we're in the air. You mentioned you haven't eaten since your connection in Germany." The soldier tried to decline, but the CEO's kind insistence won out. The businesswoman watched this interaction through the reflection in her window, pretending to be absorbed in the view of the runway outside. But she couldn't help noticing how her boss treated the soldier with genuine respect and interest, asking about his service and his family back home. Other first-class passengers had observed the scene with approval. An elderly businessman across the aisle even struck up a conversation with the soldier, sharing stories about his own military service years ago. The warm atmosphere in their section made the businesswoman feel even more isolated in her shame. As the plane began its takeoff roll, she found herself replaying the terminal incident in her mind. Each detail now seemed to take on new significance: the soldier's polite request, her dismissive wave, the way she used her bags to occupy extra seats. How many other times had she behaved this way without thinking about the impact of her actions? The flight reached cruising altitude, and the cabin service began. The CEO had indeed arranged for a special meal for the soldier, and the flight attendants served it with obvious pleasure. They kept his coffee cup filled and made sure he had everything he needed, while maintaining a notably cooler professionalism when serving the businesswoman. Mid-flight, she overheard snippets of conversation between the CEO and the soldier. The young man was returning from a 14-month deployment, eager to surprise his family who didn't expect him for another week. He spoke about his service with humility and about his fellow soldiers with deep respect. Not once did he mention the incident in the terminal or show any sign of resentment. The businesswoman's untouched laptop sat in her bag under the seat. The presentation she'd been so focused on perfecting now seemed to mock her. Every slide about company values and community leadership felt like an indictment of her behavior. She'd written eloquent paragraphs about respect and integrity, but when it mattered, she had failed to demonstrate either. Through the plane's window, the lights of cities below twinkled like stars, reminding her of how small individual actions could seem in the grand scheme of things. Yet she was learning the hard way that sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest impact on our lives. As the flight progressed, she noticed how the CEO treated everyone with the same respectful attention, from the senior flight attendant to the young man collecting trash. It was a leadership style that didn't need to announce itself, that led by quiet example rather than bold declarations in PowerPoint presentations. The pilot announced their initial descent into Chicago, and the businesswoman felt her anxiety rising again. She knew that tomorrow would bring consequences she wasn't prepared to face. But watching the soldier's quiet dignity and her boss's genuine kindness, she realized that maybe this harsh lesson was exactly what she needed to learn. Monday morning arrived with a heavy weight of anticipation. The businesswoman stood in the elevator of the corporate headquarters, watching the floor numbers climb. Her weekend had been sleepless, filled with anxiety about this moment. The meeting request had appeared in her inbox early Sunday morning, 8 a.m. Monday, executive floor, conference room A. The office was quieter than usual when she stepped off the elevator. The early morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the empty hallways. Her heels clicked against the marble flooring, each step echoing her racing heartbeat. Outside conference room A, she paused to check her reflection in the glass wall. The mirror-like surface showed a different person than the one who had boarded that flight on Friday. Her designer suit was still perfect, her hair still immaculate, but her eyes held a new awareness that hadn't been there before. The conference room wasn't empty as she'd expected. The CEO was already there, along with the head of Human Resources and, surprisingly, the Director of Veterans Affairs, a department she'd barely interacted with before. They sat at the large oak table, several folders spread out before them. "Please have a seat," the CEO said, gesturing to a chair. His tone was professional but not harsh. The businesswoman sat down, noticing how her usual confidence had been replaced by genuine humility. The morning light filtering through the windows seemed to spotlight her position at the table. "I think we all know why we're here," the CEO began, opening one of the folders. Friday's incident at the airport revealed some concerning behaviors that directly contradict our company's core values. He paused, letting the words sink in. "However, this meeting isn't about punishment. It's about growth and understanding." The head of HR spoke next, her voice calm and measured. "We've reviewed your work history, outstanding performance reviews, impressive project completions, strong leadership potential. But leadership isn't just about business success. It's about character." The businesswoman felt her throat tighten as they discussed Friday's events. Each detail seemed sharper in the morning light of this corporate conference room. The Veterans Affairs Director leaned forward, adding his perspective about the importance of understanding and respecting military service members. Then came the surprise. Instead of the termination she feared, they presented her with a different kind of consequence. She was being reassigned, not demoted, but moved to a position that would challenge her in ways her current role never had. "You'll be heading our new Veterans Integration Program," the CEO announced. "Working directly with our Veterans Affairs team, you'll be responsible for helping military service members transition into corporate roles. This isn't a punishment, it's an opportunity to grow and to truly understand the values we promote." The businesswoman felt tears threatening to form but held them back. This wasn't the career advancement she'd been chasing, but somehow it felt more important than any promotion she'd ever received. "You'll start by spending 2 weeks at our Veteran Transition Center," the HR director explained, sliding across a detailed schedule. "You'll learn about the challenges service members face, their unique skills, and how corporate America can better serve those who've served our country." The meeting continued with detailed discussions about her new role. They talked about expectations, goals, and the impact they hoped to see. The businesswoman found herself taking notes with the same intensity she once reserved for client presentations, but now for a very different purpose. As the meeting drew to a close, the CEO shared one final thought. "Sometimes our greatest leadership lessons come from our moments of failure," he said quietly. "What matters isn't that we stumbled, but how we choose to move forward." Walking out of that conference room an hour later, the businesswoman felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Her career had taken an unexpected turn, but somehow it felt like the right path. The morning sun now seemed less harsh and more warming, illuminating not just the hallway, but a new way forward. That evening, as she packed up her office for the move to her new department, she found herself looking at her reflection in her office window. The skyline of the city stretched out behind her, a reminder of how far she'd come and how far she still had to go. Sometimes life's biggest lessons come wrapped in our most embarrassing moments, teaching us exactly what we need to learn, exactly when we need to learn it,